All right, we are live. We welcome you for joining us. We're thankful for those who join us by way of YouTube. We ask that if you have any questions about anything that you hear, that you reach out to us on our YouTube channel or get a hold of us and allow us to discuss with you any questions that you may have. Your questions are important. We love interaction and discussion in this class, so if you have a comment, please make it. Raise your hand, make some noise. I'm being chided because I forgot my hearing aids again this morning. And so I'm going to be on the struggle bus when it comes to hearing comments. And so if you need to throw something at me, throw something at me. And we'll be in Matthew chapter 2. And we got to verse 12 last week. And we're talking about the birth of Jesus, him being born in Bethlehem of Judea, that specific place that was prophesied. We've talked about Herod the king, who was a wicked and ruthless man. We're going to continue to talk about him a little bit today. We talked about last week how he gathered all the religious people and inquired of where the Christ was going to be born. And he took that information and to not use it for a good purpose, but to use it for an evil purpose, right? Oh, I want to worship this child, right? No. He wanted to kill the Christ. And so the wise men come and inquire, and it's interesting in Luke, the shepherds go right to him. These lowly shepherds, they get right to the Christ. And these wise men go in asking this question, where he is at. And so the star appeared. We talked about that last week, and it guides them and stands over where the young child was. That's verse 9. And when they saw that, they rejoiced and were exceedingly glad. And they came into the house, and what did they bring Jesus, the baby? Gifts, right? And they were kingly gifts. They were, and we talked about that phrase, where's this one that was born king of the Jews? And that's important because men aren't usually born kings. They're born into a royal family, a royal lineage. They're born princes. But this child was born king. And we talked about how Herod despised anyone who would threaten his rule and his reign. And it was said that it would be better to be Herod's pig than to be his son. He killed a wife, and he killed at least 2 of his sons. And in this class today, in a little bit, we're going to talk about some of the things that he did closer to his death. And it kind of shows what the Jews really thought about him. He was hated and respected. We talked about that. Hated for his cruelty, respected for his acumen, his ability to build, what he did to the second temple. The Jews really, boy, they loved that temple, and his ability to build and his famine relief as an administrator. He was good. But he was a wicked man. So there was that love-hate relationship that we talked about a little bit last week. The wise men, he tells them, go find the child and then come and report back to me. And they don't respond to that in a positive or a negative way. They just go about their way. And then the text tells us that in verse 12 that they were warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod. They departed into their own country another way. And so these men were truly guided by God in a special way by a dream, and said, you know, whatever you might have felt about Herod is probably right, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you, don't go talk to the king. And in verse number 13 is where we pick up. And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeareth to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise and take the young child and his mother and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. You know, in the first two classes, we talked about Joseph and how this account is told through the eyes of Joseph. And we talked about all of the stress and the tragedy that entered Joseph's life early in this account, and being that his wife, that he was betrothed to, was pregnant, and how God had to intervene and tell him, this is of the Holy Spirit. Don't be afraid to take her to be your wife. And then all of a sudden, some guys show up and they bring him gifts, and this young child, Jesus, maybe, between 18 months and 2 years old or so. And then as soon as they leave, the Lord tells him, you need to take the child and his mother and flee. So the drama keeps building, right? This little infant child has already made great waves in the world, and he's got a king after him. And Joseph is obviously a good man. He wanted to put away Mary privately, and so he was chosen by God to be the earthly father of Jesus. What does that tell you about who Joseph is and the kind of man, the kind of character, the kind of home that he would lead? He was the one that was chosen by God. What a task, right? Well, the tasks just keep getting greater, because the angel of the Lord tells him, arise, take the child and the mother, which this is another instance where the child is listed before the mother, which goes against the historical way that the family would be listed. The children would not be listed before the parents. But there's something special about Jesus, right? He's not just the child, he's the God child. He is God in the flesh. And so he's listed first again. And he departed into Egypt. Now, Egypt at this time is a province of Rome. It's under Roman leadership. So it would not be strange for Joseph to go to Egypt, first off, because that's where God told him to go. And so Joseph, being a godly man, is going to do what God tells him to do. But we're told by secular history that there was a great Jewish community in Egypt at this time. Around 40 AD, Philo records for us that there was probably a population of Jewish people in Egypt about 1 million. So there was a good number of people, of Jews in Egypt. We know at this time there would have been synagogues that have come on the scene. And this is after the dispersion. The Jewish people have started worshiping God in synagogues, which God was going to use to bring about New Testament worship. New Testament worship grew out of the synagogue system of worship. What was relegated to the temple? Instrumental music. The Levites were commanded to play the instrument in the temple. And so if you weren't a Levite, you couldn't play the instrument. If you weren't in the temple, you couldn't play the instrument. And history tells us that synagogue worship and song was devoted to the word, and it was completely a cappella. If you want to see the quote from the Judea Encyclopedia that I have, which is not a Christian source, this is a source of just Jewish history, that is recorded and for your benefit and our consumption. But they would have been able to completely and without fear of Herod, raise their child and live in Egypt without and honor their what they needed to do as Jews, and so that's a good thing. Right. He was a king, but it was over a region, right? He was not even a Jew. He was just a political figure, and he was Rome's fanboy. And so he was able to live through several Roman emperors, but he was so good to Rome, and he laid such a tax burden on the people, but he was so good at what he did, and he was a great builder, and so he just worked it out where he was able to live successively and reign successively, although, and when we think about this, all of this was in God's plan, wasn't it? God is able to use the good and the bad and the indifferent, the beautiful and the ugly to bring about his will, right? And Herod was definitely part of God's plan to use. Whoever is put in power by God's allowance, right? God allows us mankind to be involved in government, right? And Daniel, he raises up kings. Jesus told Pilate, you would have no power except for what? My Father gave it to you, right? And so, but God is involved in the kingdoms of men. And so Herod is going to be used by God to accomplish several things. And we'll talk about those soon. Verse number 14, when he arose, this tells us that he did not wait a minute. As soon as the dream came, how fast did Joseph act? He jumps up out of bed, gathers his wife and child, and they leave. Joseph didn't procrastinate. He didn't wait. He did that immediately. He took the young child and his mother by night. That lets you know he didn't wait till morning. He didn't wait to see, and it also tells us that they may have been poor people. There wasn't much to gather up, and there wasn't time to do it. They just gathered themselves, and they go by night. And let's see, and they departed into Egypt. Verse 15, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt have I called my son. It's interesting. What came out of Egypt years and years before? The nation of Israel, right? And so out of Egypt, the nation of Israel was called. It was evident that God was it was not the nation of Israel that was going to be able to save the world. It wasn't the nation of Israel that was going to be completely and wholly obedient to God's will. They have shown us over and over throughout the Bible their inability to honor God's law, to keep his will, to not be stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. They were a stiff-necked people. So God raised up his son, and there's several chapters in Isaiah that we could look at, and we will in the future, where the promise of salvation begins nationalistically. But the nation fails over and over and over. And so then it narrows to the Son of God, and that's Jesus. And so he calls him out of Egypt. There's a likeness there. It's interesting. And it is a fulfillment of prophecy. Verse number 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth. Men and go ahead. Right. Right. They had been given gifts. We know they were given gold, right? So they had something that they could take with them to make do. What does God do for his people? Provides. Philippians 4:19, and my God shall supply how many of your needs? All of your needs, according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. God is a supplier of needs, and it was no different for his son than it is for us. God supplies our needs. I'm going to go back up and mention again. He says, by the prophet, out of Egypt have I called my son. Do you think that they realized and recognized that the nation had already come out of Egypt? Yes. And that the nation of Israel had been disobedient to God. And in a way, this is setting up a juxtaposition of the disobedient nation of Israel and the obedient Son of God. And they're both coming out of the same place, but the Son of God, the nation is not worthy to be called. the Son of God. Only Jesus is going to be able to do his will completely and totally. And that's going to set up the narrative for the rest of the New Testament and what Jesus is able to accomplish that the nation of Israel never was. Herod saw that he was mocked. What happens to men who are powerful and full of pride when things don't go their way? They get angry. Herod was a man who was definitely corrupted by power. What is that saying that we all know? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. How often is that true? That's always true. It's always true. Mankind does not have the ability to function with that kind of power. We need checks and balances. Namely, the check and balance that keeps powerful Christian men in check is what? This. This right here will keep a powerful man humble, recognizing and realizing his dependence on God. What happens to powerful men? They become self-sufficient, right? I'm in control of this. I've got this. You must bow to me. I bow to no one, right? And in all actuality, how many of us are to bow to Christ, to submit to God, to recognize his ultimate authority, his ultimate kingship and rulers? Anyone that ever lived. Yes, anyone that ever lived. How many of us are going to stand before the ultimate king? All of us are going to appear, 2 Corinthians 5:10. That's Revelation, I believe it's 20. I saw the small and great stand before God. That's all of us. Every knee shall bow. Every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of the Father. Philippians 2, and I think it's about verse 8 or so. That gets us all. None of us are left out of that. None of us are above it. And it would do us all well to live that way and to have leaders who live that way. But he saw that he was mocked. The wise men that took to Herod, and we noticed how many wise men were there. Probably a good many of them. You're not going to have 2 or 3 guys come into town and get the king's attention. There was probably a host of these men. They had a caravan who traveled a long distance, and it got the king's attention, right? And so he sees this great multitude of people seeking another king, and he gives them a command to come back, and they just completely just blow that off. And he says, they've mocked me. They have made a fool of me. I've commanded them to do X. They have not done X. And so for his poor little old heart, it's just more than he can stand. It's just more than he can deal with. People don't treat me this way. I'm Herod the Great. That inscription, the Great, right? That's who he was in his mind. That's who he was according to worldly standards, Herod the Great. But he was dealing with and chasing after the great.
Interesting that the text doesn't say that he went after the wise men.
Right. Yeah.
He might have, it just doesn't tell.
Yeah, it doesn't tell us. But I think that he recognized, well, they've got me. They've not come back and they've not obeyed. And so he was exceeding wroth. He was very mad. He was so upset that what he decided to do was one of the most unthinkable things that you could ever imagine a human being doing. And he sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem and in all the coast thereof from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. And now you get a composite picture of the evil that is Herod the Great. he decided, he said, okay, the star appeared at this time. So to make sure that I get this child murdered, I'm going to decree and order that every child 2 years old and under is killed. Every man, every male child.
Go back, he was wanting to worship this child. And when the wise men come back, that's what they're going to do. We're supposed to try to kill him. So he, what you just said, he would kill all of those that were in either 2 years old there, and take care of it. Like I said, he was that mad.
Yeah, he was that mad. He was going to worship him with a sword, right? He was going to, that was his plan. And he gets all that are in Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem was not a big place. Bethlehem, they say with the population of that time, that, and this is interesting because this event is not recorded in secular history. There's no record of Herod killing all the babies 2 years old and under, and that's shocking to us, isn't it? We would think that we would find this account in secular history. What's some reasons why it may not be recorded?
There's not that many of them. There couldn't have been more than 10 to 30 because it's a small community, 2 years and under.
Yeah. Right. That's a great answer. So yeah, by the population, and I've read that very thing, that there would have been maybe 10 to 30 children, which is a travesty. Let's not make light of that. But in comparison to some of the other tragedies that have taken place at the hands of Herod, that was considered pretty menial. That was considered
Thinking about how much he committed his head, that they feared him so much that they would kill little babies on his voice order. How many soldiers today would go out and kill babies? Potentially like that.
You know, there had been, and we're going to get into it right here because of Rachel weeping in the text. There had been a carrying away when the children of Israel were carried away into captivity, and the soldiers slew the children and the women and ripped the babies out of the womb and dashed them in the streets. This had happened on a large scale before. It's a very good point that who is in control of the media? The government, right? We say that all, that's evident in our time, right? The government controls the media in a large measure. It was like that at this time. The king, if he didn't want something put out, it probably wasn't going to. He would have a great ability to take care of that.
Herod was a Roman, right?
No, he was a Roman puppet.
He wasn't a Jew.
He's Edomite. Yeah. So he was that dynasty evil. He has a son that's mentioned here that was also like his father, with all the wickedness but none of the greatness. The greatness of Herod the Great was in his ability to be an administrator, in his ability to build great architectural things. That was the good of Herod. His son that's mentioned here had none of those qualities. He was just a brute beast. And so it was after Herod the Great's death, we'll get to this in just a moment, but the Jews cried so greatly out against his son that Rome disposed of him and set up a different system of ruling, and that's where we get a man like Pilate, who was a tetrarch, who was a governor over a smaller area. All of this is important to setting up what we're going to find in the New Testament. He was mocked, he was mad, and then he sends forth to slay the children. Now, isn't this interesting? That this is the reaction that humankind has to God coming into the world. God chooses, because it's the only way that salvation to the world is going to come, God chooses to come to earth and to put on flesh. He could have come as a warrior king, just appeared with flesh and bone, but he appeared as the most innocent and defenseless form that he could have ever come. And it's in that form that mankind is seeking to destroy him. Isn't that interesting? You ever thought about that? Jesus came into the world in the most humble state, in the most innocent, defenseless form, and the reaction to that was, we got to kill him. Did that ever change? No. I mean, it did for a moment. It did for a moment. When he was feeding the multitudes, they wanted to take him by force and sit him on the throne. And he said, oh, you're following me for food and not for faith. You're following me, and you're all into what I'm doing, and you're striving for the meat that perishes, but I'm offering you got to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And that was a hard saying. Who could hear it? And from that time, many turned and did not follow him anymore. And once he started elucidating further upon his teachings and admitted, yes, I'm the Son of God, they wanted to kill him. And they eventually were successful in that effort. So he goes to slay all the babies in Bethlehem, and he had diligently inquired. Verse 17, then was fulfilled that was spoken by Jeremy the prophet, saying, in Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted, because they are not. As we mentioned a moment ago, this had found fulfillment earlier, in a sense, in the carrying away of the nation and the slaughter of a great number of innocent children and women and men. And Rachel stands for a motherly figure in Israel. She is pictured as the mother of all of them. And so she is pictured as one who cares for all of the trials and burdens and stresses and tragedies for the nation. But Matthew grabs this prophecy and he says, this is the fullest sense in which this prophecy is fulfilled. You saw how it was used here in the exile, in the going away, and in the tragedy. But this was only typical. The truest sense in which Jeremiah was speaking is right here, and it's fulfilled in Jesus. It's fulfilled in these young people's detriment, and when they were killed as the Christ child was being sought. In verse number 19, but when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeareth in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. So Herod eventually dies. And is that a good thing? Is it a good thing when an evil ruler is taken from this world? In a sense, yes. Who made Herod make the decisions that he made to be evil? Did anybody put a gun to his head and force him to do all the evil things that he did? No. It's part of the part of the struggle with accepting the fate of an evil person and then saying it at the same time, whatever he gets is God's justice. Herod has been in a very bad place for a very long time. But that's the justice of God. In Genesis 18 and 25, God is talking to Abraham about what he's going to do to Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham makes a very poignant statement. He said, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" And the answer to that question is yes. Whatever the punishment is for these people, it's right. But their being removed from society is a good thing. It is a good thing that their reign of terror can be perpetuated no more, and that the people can maybe breathe easier because they're no longer in power. Now, it doesn't happen that way immediately, because this guy's got a son that's going to take the reins. It's just as bad or worse in every respect. Comment? I'm hearing things. Okay. But the Lord appears to Joseph in a dream. They're in Egypt, and he says, "Arise, take the young child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead which sought the young child's life." And so he is going to return back, but he doesn't return back to Bethlehem. Where does he go to? Nazareth. And that's also going to be a fulfillment of prophecy. Now, we got to figure out in what sense that's a fulfillment of prophecy. Because when he says, he arose, verse 21, and took the young child and his mother and came to the land of Israel. Verse 22, but when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go thither, notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside into the parts of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. Now, this is an interesting section that I was hoping that we would get to, and it just turned 12 o'clock, which is time to eat. And if you take a good look at me, you know that we're ready to do that. And so we're going to have to pick up and take on verses 20 through 23 next Sunday, and we will hopefully get into chapter 3 as well. Thank you so much for your participation and your attention. God bless you.